Hey everybody, so we're going to wrap up the civil rights movement by looking at some of the leaders and groups and kind of comparing and contrasting their philosophies and what they accomplished during their role in the civil rights movement. We need to just review a little bit the accomplishments of Martin Luther King. There is a reason why Martin Luther King is seen as the consummate and ultimate leader of the civil rights struggle. But we also want to contrast his leadership and philosophy with some of the later, more radical leaders that were prevalent as well. So let's remind ourselves what we know about his philosophy. He believed in nonviolence and passive resistance. So that's required a whole lot of training and intention when he worked with his activists, because they had to be willing to break the law. That's called civil disobedience, breaking laws that you believe are unjust. But they also had to peacefully and lovingly be willing to accept the consequences that associated with breaking the law. So that usually entailed police brutality, arrest, imprisonment, and they had to accept all of those things without retribution or self-defense and remain peaceful in the whole process. So it required an incredible amount of self-restraint and control. The whole goal of that philosophy was to court arrest, get arrested, fill the jails, make it impossible for law enforcement to continue enforcing those laws, to create tension that would force the changing of those laws. And he was very successful using those strategies, and leading his followers were successful in getting concrete changes to the law and legislative accomplishments. It all started, if you remember, when he won the bus boycott, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery. He took leadership of that 371-day bus boycott. He then became the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He helped coordinate the protests in Birmingham and was imprisoned in Birmingham and wrote letters from a Birmingham jail. He led the March on Washington. He obtained the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 through that incredible campaign. And then through the Selma campaign and the March from Selma to Montgomery and the Freedom Summer activities, they helped obtain the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the legislative accomplishments are there, the manifestation of his philosophy on the ground in southern states throughout the region really speak to his accomplishments and why he was seen as the ultimate and most preeminent leader of the civil rights movement. Now, what we see by 64, 65, 66, 67 is a growing impatience on the part of specifically young people, but also some other groups, with this requirement that we be nonviolent and not engage in self-defense. So one of the leading voices in that philosophy was a man by the name of Malcolm Little, who later accepted or preferred the name Malcolm X. There are really two different manifestations of Malcolm X as a thought leader, and so we want to talk about both of them. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and his parents were actually followers of Marcus Garvey and fairly strident in their views. His father's death, there's a lot of controversy surrounding it. It was the opinion of Malcolm and some other family members that white supremacists had participated in the killing of his father. Others said it was a suicide, others said it was a streetcar accident. But at any rate, he leaves Omaha, Nebraska. He goes on to places such as Detroit and then Harlem and then Boston, and was involved in illegal activities in those cities and eventually was imprisoned. When he went to prison, he came into the presence of a man named Elijah Muhammad, who is the leader of a radical religious sect called the Nation of Islam, and claimed to be a prophet on earth, and recruited and converted Malcolm to that faith. And as a member of the Nation of Islam, he was a most famous spokesperson for a period of time. The Nation of Islam is also called the Black Muslims. That's capital B, capital M, the Black Muslims. And they are a radical religious sect that marries Islamic religious tradition with a radical race theory. And they actually are really quite unique in and point outable in society. When you see a member of the Nation of Islam, they exist even today. They wear suits, ties, hats. They do not engage in things that are traditionally associated with Black stereotypes. So they believe that those Black stereotypes and other illicit substances are used by white people and the government to keep Black people oppressed. So members of the Nation of Islam do not use profanity. They do not engage in premarital sex. They do not drink alcohol. They do not do illicit drugs. They do not eat watermelon. They don't eat pork. They don't eat fried chicken. They very much dissociate themselves with a lot of those Black stereotypes. So they're a pretty notable religious sect within the United States as a group. They believed that they actually agree with white separatists like the KKK. They believed that Black and white people could really never live in mutual peace and harmony to the benefit of the Black race. So they thought it would be better if we just separated and white people went their way and Black people went their way. Maybe we separated the country, but they didn't really think that the long-term interests of Black people could be served by their interaction with white people. They also believed that if you were being attacked by someone, you should fight back. And if they had guns, you should have guns. So there was a sense of armed self-defense there as well. And an intention to definitely defend the Black woman as well. As the leader of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X inspired an incredible amount of sense of empowerment and Black pride and a sense of pride in one's identity. He was an incredibly eloquent spokesperson and lived out the key tenets of his faith and his philosophy. Problems began to manifest themselves within the Nation of Islam, though, as Malcolm X became more and more famous. The Prophet Elijah Muhammad and other leaders of the Nation of Islam began to feel like he was taking up a lot of space, and people were more familiar with him than with the actual religious leader, that being the Prophet. Malcolm X started to see some distance between what the philosophy of the nation was and the activities of its actual leaders and the Prophet. He started to wonder why the Prophet had so many material possessions and how the money was being used in the organization, and the moral compass of the Prophet didn't always seem to be in alignment with the ideals of the organization. So as tensions began to grow between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, he finally decided that he would just go do his pilgrimage to Mecca, as all Muslims are required to do, at least once in their lifetime. So he decided to go do that pilgrimage. On that pilgrimage, he has an amazing awakening to the fact that actually Islam is much bigger than the Nation of Islam and the Black Muslims, that it's a diverse and energetic and bigger than anything he understood. He actually converted to be a Sunni Muslim, which is one of the two main branches of Islam. And from that moment on, he just realized that all the racial theories of his previous beliefs were flawed. So when he returned from Mecca, he actually changed his philosophy. And he started wanting to not seek separation of the races, but instead he agreed that we should seek integration and peace and equality between the races, not separation. And that we should, in fact, strengthen Black communities, but not through the separation of the races. This, of course, puts him at odds now with his former teachers in the Nation of Islam, and tensions grow between them. By 1965, he is giving a speech in New York, and men with suits come in. A distraction is created in the front rows of the auditorium. That makes people fear that there might be a small fire breaking out. And then the people in the back with the guns, while that distraction is going on, open fire and riddle Malcolm X's body with bullets. And he dies in that auditorium in New York. So he was martyred for criticizing the Nation of Islam. A lot of people remember the earlier manifestation of Malcolm X, but fewer people the kind of by any means necessary manifestation of him, but very few people remember that he actually changed his entire philosophy and actually worked to establish a new organization called the Organization for Afro-American Unity. So a very interesting and dynamic person in the struggle for Black equality. This is pictures of Malcolm X and him in Egypt as well. All right, another important person who began criticizing the philosophy of Martin Luther King was Stokely Carmichael. He was in the SNCC, the SNCC version, college student version of Martin Luther King's organization. Actually, by the time the march from Selma to Montgomery happened, Stokely Carmichael had kind of already decided that he was tired of these pacifist methods, and he wanted to be a little more strident and not work so much in concert with white people in seeking empowerment of black people. So while he was on the 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, he was actually stopping and getting contact information for people along the way who might be interested in a more strident form of resistance to white supremacy. He eventually called this idea Black Power, and that became a brand or kind of a slogan that he was associated with. Though his idea was if people are violent to you, you should meet violence with violence. And that blacks should define their own goals and they should run their own organizations. And this is when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee really starts to sideline white activists who had previously in the Freedom Rides and other campaigns, Freedom Summer, had been very integral to the movement. They began to separate them out and think that black activists should work solely with black activists and define their own organization and their own goals. So Stokely Carmichael didn't really ever bring a lot of organizational fortitude behind his ideas. He was largely just symbolic and a spokesperson for his ideas, but we didn't see a whole lot of organizational heft underneath those ideas until he later joins the Black Panthers. So this is Stokely Carmichael on the left, and I'm about to speak about the Olympics of 1968. In the Olympics of 1968, they were in Mexico City, and Tommy Smith there is in the gold medal position at the Olympics, and Juan Carlos is in the bronze position. They decided to symbolically communicate their support for Stokely Carmichael's Black Power vision by raising their fists and not looking at the national, not looking at the flag as it was raised and during the national anthem at their medal award ceremony for winning the 200-meter relay, the 200-meter race at the Olympics. This was probably the most symbolic and important moment of the whole Black Power brand that was established by Stokely Carmichael. The Olympic Committee tried to force the American Olympic Committee to banish these two men from the Olympic Village and not let them compete. They resisted, but then were told that the whole American track team might be banned from competition further if they did not take some action. So they eventually were banned from the Olympic Village. And one interesting thing is that it says in some sources I have consulted that their medals were taken from them. But I heard Juan Carlos being interviewed just recently on NPR, and he said he still has his medals. So that's an interesting historical sidelight that I'm not sure how it came to pass in reality. But at any rate, that was the height of the Black Power symbol movement. Now, two men named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they decided to establish a much more radical, revolutionary-based organization called the Black Panthers. And eventually they will invite Stokely Carmichael to come over and be their prime minister of their organization. The Black Panthers were quite radical in their philosophy and serve a strong contrast to Martin Luther King. They actually wanted a race war, a revolution, and to not be in a defensive self-defense stance, as even Malcolm X had suggested, but actually to be on the offense. They wanted to fight police brutality. They did so pretty in an interesting way. They would follow the cops around, mainly in Oakland, California, the Los Angeles area as well, and they would follow the cops around open carrying large weapons, which was their right under the Second Amendment, and would just monitor the police to try and end police brutality. This really unnerved the police, as well as a lot of people in the wider society who were nervous about black men carrying weapons around openly. And this is actually the beginning of a lot of gun laws to restrict the right of people to exercise their Second Amendment rights. So a lot of people don't realize that gun control was actually started by folks who were concerned about the Second Amendment expression of the Black Panther movement. They really wanted Black people to take control of their communities and be elected to lead them, and to make sure that immigrant communities or white people were not the ones in control of businesses and did not hold positions of local political power in Black communities. They also thought that Black people should be exempted from military service, since they had been disproportionately drafted in Vietnam, and they felt that the country did not actually look out for their general welfare. They wanted armed revolt, and they felt that the justice system was racist and that all Black people who were in prison should be let out, and that Black people should only be tried by juries of Black people. So this is their 10-point plan or 10-point program, and you can tell from it that it was a pretty radical statement of what their vision was. They became well known for their black berets and military fatigues, and there was also a time when Huey Newton was imprisoned, accused of shooting 2 police officers in Oakland. That eventually led to the Free Huey movement. There's a retrial 2 times, both times with a hung jury, and eventually Huey Newton was freed from jail, and they could not prove that he had in any way been guilty of shooting those police officers. So the Free Huey movement was a big part of their brand as well. Later, Bobby Seale was at the Democratic Convention of 1968, and he was arrested. He was part of what's called the Chicago 8. He was sentenced to prison and his trial was very high profile. He was found in 30 counts of contempt and forced to serve many years in prison, actually, related to his participation, but also failure to conform to what was expected in the courts in terms of behavior. And so both of these men did serve some time in prison. Bobby Seale is still alive, and Huey Newton died in August of 1989 was shot by someone who was trying to make sure that their gang controlled crack dealing in the Oakland area. In their time period, the brand of the Black Panthers became quite famous. A lot of people are less familiar with the actual substantive and good work they did on the ground. One is that they did establish daycares for Black children that focused on an Afrocentric curriculum. They also had a free breakfast and job program in California that served up to 10,000 meals a day to give Black men employment coaching as well as all types of mentoring. So they did actually establish kind of grassroots organizations as well as just a sense of empowerment and a radical alternative to the philosophies of Martin Luther King and to some degree even Malcolm X. The Black Panther Party is still around in some version even today, but Bobby Seale and Huey Newton do not play a significant role in it as far as I know. All right, so that is a summation of the major philosophies and leaders in the early as well as late civil rights movement. Sorry I went a little long, but I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Thanks a lot.